So we know how to navigate exactly to a specific work item, but we don't necessarily know which work item to navigate to. If we look at the work items grid, one of the great features of UiPath is that we're able to extract information from a web page or a table on a web page into a data table. This means that we can manipulate the data and do various things with it. So let's go back into UiPath and create a new component. This component is going to be called Acme Extract Work Items. Let's create the component. Now I'll leave it to you guys to add the logs. This time we're going to use the data scraping tool, which can be found in the top menu. UiPath asks us to select an element. Let's click Next. Let's click on Actions, which is on the title menu of the data table. UiPath recognizes that this is a table and asks, do we want to extract the whole data? Yes, we do. At the bottom, let's select 0 to make sure that all rows are extracted, not just a limited number. Click Finish. And then we're asked, is data spanning multiple pages? Yes, it is. It's identified with this arrow that's pointing right. We'll click that. Okay, great. We now have an activity called Extract Structured Data Table, and this activity has an output of a data table. In this case, UiPath has automatically called it Extract Data Table. We're going to rename it to make this more obvious. We're going to call it DT Work Items. I like to use the shorthand notation DT because it clearly identifies this as a data table to anyone else picking up my workflow. So now we have the data table in a variable. Let's create a log message to show how many rows are contained within that data table. Let's type data table DT work items contains, and then we're going to reference our variable DT work items. You can see straight away UiPath recognizes that there's a variable called DT work items. We'll select it. We'll type rows.count.toString. Okay, so let's run the robot and see what output we get. Okay, it looks like this isn't working properly because normally you'd see the robot navigating between the different pages. Let's wait for it to error and find out what the problem was. This may have worked successfully for you depending on which arrow you clicked. If it didn't work for you, then the way to fix it is to click on the next link selector, click on Indicate Element. You may notice there's a very slight difference between the arrow itself and the circle which the arrow is contained within. We need to make sure that the arrow on its own is the item that's selected. And you can see that the name of the selector is slightly different to the selector that we had before. Okay, let's go ahead and run this and see if that improves our results. Great. Now we can see that the pages are being worked through by the robot until it reaches the final page. Great. Once the robot's finished, we can go to the output pane. This time we can see that the DT work items table contains 107 records, which is what we'd expect. Great stuff. Now that we've extracted our data from the application, what we need to do is filter the information that we have to only accept the items that are WI5 and a status of open. However, before we start doing that, I've just noticed that we need to tidy up the folder structure. I've got some Acme components which need to be placed into the Acme folder. Like so, and we're good to go. So, first things first, it's a good idea to separate out components. The different types of components that we want to separate are either components that change screen. So if you're changing screen in an application, then you'll want to potentially create a new component. This is not always the case, but is generally a good advice. Additionally, it's a good idea to separate any logic from any UI automation. The reason for doing this is that if we have some complex logic, which is, for example, filtering the data table, we don't always want to have to go and navigate to that web page in the application in order to run the logic and the test. So by separating out the logic from the UI automation component, we're much more easily able to test further down the line. So we already have our component here, Acme Extract Work Items, which extracts the data from the work items table. What we need to do next is create an argument out of this component, which is going to pass the data table back to a process layer. Let's quickly do that by changing the variable that's been created, DT work items, into an argument. Let's first create the argument, and it's going to be out because we're passing the data table out of the component. We'll call it the same thing, DT work items, but we're going to have an out prefix. The direction of the argument will be out, and there's no default value. Always remember to delete the DT work items variable, because we're now going to be using the out DT work items argument. Initially, this will cause an error, but we simply need to change any reference to DT work items to the argument out DT work items. We can see that there's an error because there's a blue exclamation mark, and if we hover over the exclamation mark, we can see what the error is. This actually says one or more children have validation errors or warnings. If we go to the property of the data table, we can see that it says value of type string cannot be converted to system data.datatable. So even though we've changed the variable to the argument, what's not correct is the type of argument. Let's change it, data table, and the error will disappear. Additionally, we also have a reference to DT work items in our log message, which we also need to change to the argument name. Click off, errors disappear. So now what we can do is call that component or workflow from a process layer or from a different workflow. Let's go ahead and do that. Take an invoke workflow activity. Let's temporarily disable the Acme login component because we don't need that for the time being, and also move the get password into the ignored activities. Let's go and find our new component, extract work items, press open, import arguments, and let's now create a new variable in our process layer called DT work items. This will automatically be created as a data table type. And to prove that the data coming out of that component is correct, let's put a very quick log message. And let's print the number of rows that were passed out of that component in the out argument for DT work items. Notice that we're using the variable DT work items, not the argument, because that's what we've passed it to in this process layer. And if you are struggling with the concept of arguments and variables, you're not alone. Many people struggle with these concepts, so please use the community forum if you have questions specifically around arguments and variables, or any other questions. So just going to make sure that we're in the right place in the work items page. Let's get back to page 1. Okay, so let's run this process and see what results we get. Once again, the robot loops through the table. And when the robot completes, we can take a look at the output. Now we'll see 2 log messages, one from the component, which is data table out. DT work items contains 107. And then in our process, we also have the same log message. And the great news is that the number of rows in both tables matches perfectly. Now that we've got the data table in our process, next up we'll be creating a component which will filter the data, giving us just those work items, which are WI5 and status of open. So now what we need to do is create a new component, which is going to filter the data that we're going to pass in from the data table that we extracted in Acme extract work items. To do this, we could use Excel, but to do this, we'd have to save the data table to an Excel file and then use the filter activity to filter the data. This isn't as an efficient way of performing this task. So what we're going to do instead is use a DT select statement. But first up, let's create our new component. And this time, rather than creating it from scratch, I'm going to copy one of my better components, which is navigate to work items. To do this, go into File Explorer and find your project in Documents, UiPath, Acme Academy Process, and Acme. I'm going to copy and paste, rename. This time, the component is going to be generic. This means that it's not specific to the Acme application. We're going to call it filter data table. Because it's not part of the Acme application, we're going to move it into a new folder called generic. Once that's done, go back to your UiPath project, press refresh, and you'll see your new generic folders being created. Let's open it up and let's make changes rather than starting from scratch. So, of course, we need to change the name of the component. What I like to do is have a variable with the component name, which means that we only ever need to change it in one place from now on. Let's call this component name. And what we're doing is starting to build our way up towards a more common template that we can use for all components. Let's do the same with the finished. In this case, the str component name variable has been created as an object. In fact, we need it to be a string value rather than an object, hence why we're getting an error message. In the default value, let's put the name of our component, which is generic filter data table. Okay, and let's have a look at what else we might need to change. Well, obviously we don't have a WID argument coming in. Currently, we have an argument coming in called inWID. Of course, we don't need that for our generic filter data table component. Instead, we're going to have a data table coming in. Because we want to keep the component generic, we're actually just going to call this in data table. This means we could use this for multiple different components, not just specifically for the work items table. Argument type coming in is going to be a data table, and we're going to leave the default value as blank. Now, we get an error here, which says value of type system data table cannot be converted to string. That's because we're performing a string activity on the data table argument. Instead, let's check if the data table is nothing. Control space to get the IntelliSense to prompt, and type is nothing. Let's change the exception message and say the data table was empty. Additionally, we might want to check if the data table has 0 rows, which is different to it not existing at all. To do this, let's type or else in datatable.rows.count equals 0. The or else means that the formula that happens on the right-hand side only occurs if the formula on the left-hand side evaluates to true. So if the data table is nothing, an exception will be thrown. If it's not nothing, then we'll check to see whether the data table rows equals 0. Else, what we're going to do is log the number of rows in the data table, just to prove that the number of rows that is coming in is the value that was expected. The number of rows in data table. Again, keeping the message generic so that we don't need to change it each time. Rows.count.string. So now we have the basis for our component. We don't have any activities here. And I'm just going to change the name of this to something a bit more generic, like perform actions. Great. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to filter the data table so that we only have items with a type of WI5 and a status of open. Let's take an activity, and we're going to use an assign to do this. Okay. When we filter a data table, we're going to end up with an array of data rows. So we're going to create a variable called array data rows. Don't worry about the error message for now. We're going to select in data table dot select, and then we're going to put some syntax in here, which is type equals WI5. Pay attention to the difference between double quotes and single quotes, and status equals open, all in double quotes. So actually, rather than creating an array of data rows as a variable, let's create it as an argument, which we can then pass out into our process layer. Out array of data rows. This is going to have a direction of out, and this is going to be an array of data rows. This choose system.data data row, and hopefully our error message disappears. Super. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're effectively running SQL, if you've ever used SQL, or a filter query, which is saying from our data table, select anything that is WI5 type and status of open. The only thing that's really difficult is working out where the double quotes and single quotes go. Now we have our array of data rows. Let's just quickly log the number of rows that have been picked up as part of the filter. So with the array of data rows, because they're already rows, you don't need to have the dot rows syntax, just out array data rows dot count dot to string. One thing to note is that this component won't work on its own. That's because we don't currently have a data table coming into this component. The easiest way to do this is to have the component run following the Acme extract work items component. So we're going to extract the work items from the application, and then we're going to run our generic filtered data table component. Another way of adding a component into the process layer is to go into your project, find the component on the left-hand side, and drag it across into the main pane. This automatically selects the filter data table component. We'll click import arguments. Here's where it's expecting a data table in. This data table in is going to be the data table that's come out of our extract work items component. If we have a quick look, we've saved this into a variable called dt work items. Therefore, we need to pass that dt work items variable back into the new component, generic filter data table. The argument coming out, array data rows, can be stored in a new variable. And in this case, we're going to make it process specific. So we're going to call this Control K to set the variable name, array work items. This makes it easier for us to know exactly what is contained within those work items, even though the component that created the work items is a generic component. UiPath automatically recognizes that that needs to be an array of data rows. A new variable is created. Finally, we're going to shift the log message, which contains our number of rows in dt work items, to above our generic filter data table workflow, and then create a second log message, which is going to tell us how many rows are in the new array. Let's log the number of rows in our new array of work items. Once again, we don't need the rows syntax in this case, so we can remove that. Okay, so quickly let's make sure that we're on the first page of our work items data table. Press run, and let's see what outputs we get. So if we take a look at our output pane, we'll see that the original number of rows in the data table was 107. Following the filter, we now have 15 rows. I leave it to you guys to check that that's the right number of items for type WI5 and status of open.